Good afternoon, Ribsy readers. We are going to get started with Chapter 6 today. Chapter 6 is titled, The Famous Dog. When I read the title of that chapter, I really start to think about what those words mean. When I think about which dog Beverly Cleary is talking about, I'm pretty sure she's talking about Ribsy. But then when I think about the fact that she chose the word famous, it makes me start to think, what's going to make Ribsy famous? Well, if I think back to the events from Chapter 5, one event certainly sticks out. And that's when Ribsy almost ruined, did technically for one team, the football game. Then he gets his picture in the paper sitting next to Joe. So I'm wondering if having his picture in the newspaper is why Beverly Cleary chose to title this new chapter, The Famous Dog. I'm also wondering about Henry. We heard a lot about Ribsy in the last chapter, and Beverly Cleary often goes back and forth from Henry's perspective of the story to Ribsy's perspective of the story. So I'm wondering if perhaps in Chapter 6, we're going to hear a little bit more from Henry's perspective. Remember, when we last left off, Henry's parents had suggested that maybe he get another dog. Henry was absolutely adamantly against this particular suggestion, and he felt as though maybe Ribsy was trying to get back to him right at that very moment. So let's get started with Chapter 6, The Famous Dog. Henry Huggins was zigzagging down his street on his bicycle, delivering the Journal. Out of habit, he glanced back over his shoulder to see what Ribsy was doing. Of course, Ribsy was not there. Imagine how he must have felt in that moment. He certainly would have been having a blue zone moment right there, right? You're used to having your dog with you. You and your dog do the paper route every single day, and then you look back because it's such a habit, but you realize Ribsy's not there. It had been a month since he had loped after Henry's bicycle, and still Henry could not get over feeling that Ribsy was somehow following him. A dull, heavy sensation filled Henry, as it always did when he forgot and looked back for Ribsy. Henry flung a journal extra hard. A month. Ribsy could have chewed through a dozen ropes and dug under a dozen fences. Those girls who had given him the bubble bath didn't live more than 10 miles away. A healthy dog like Ribsy didn't need a month to walk 10 miles, even if he did have to stop and chew through a rope or two and turned his way around a few fences. Even allowing for a dog fight every now and then, it should still not take Ribsy a whole month to walk 10 miles. Hey, Henry. It was Henry's friend Beezus walking down the street with her little sister Ramona. Ramona was busy stepping on all the cracks, just to show she wasn't afraid of breaking her mother's back. If you're wondering why the author wrote that part, there is a saying that if you step on a crack, you'll break your mother's back. So when you're walking down the sidewalk, you're supposed to try to not step on any of the cracks that were there. Hey, has Ribsy come home yet? Asked Beezus. No. Henry paused by the curb, even though he didn't feel like talking about Ribsy, not even with Beezus, who, for a girl, was pretty sensible. Ribsy was such a nice dog, said Beezus. Ramona stopped stepping on the cracks. Why don't you get a horse instead? Ramona suggested. Oh, Ramona, don't be silly, said Beezus. Henry couldn't keep a horse in the city. I'd look pretty funny delivering papers with a horse following me, said Henry. But you could ride him, Ramona pointed out. Henry felt a little ridiculous. Of course he would ride a horse if he had a horse. He would gallop up and down his street, flinging papers from the saddlebags. He would be something like Paul Revere. "Aw," muttered Henry, wondering how Ramona had managed to get him off on such a wild train of thought. I don't really want a horse. I do. Ramona went on stepping on the cracks. Henry pedaled slowly, leaning to the right and then to the left, as if pushing the bicycle pedals was hard work. Ribsy was not coming back. He knew it now. He might as well stop telephoning the Humane Society and leaving a food dish on the back porch. He might as well throw away the old tennis ball. Let's stop for a minute and think about, because I know as I looked out, or if I was around, I was able to look out at you and see your expressions as we just read that part, we would know that you'd have a sad expression on your face, because now it seems like Henry is actually starting to give up. and starting to feel like he's done everything he possibly could, but Ribsy's just not coming back. Maybe Ribsy had found a home he liked better. Maybe he had found a home with some rich boy who fed him T-bone steaks instead of canned dog food. Maybe the rich boy's mother let him sleep on the front of the rich boy's bed. Maybe the rich boy's family let him ride in their brand new car all the time without ever making him chase through the rain first. While the piano in the sailor's living room went plink, plunk, plunk, Ribsy sat down in front of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Joe, who was turning out to be the kind of boy Ribsy expected him to be, obligingly opened the refrigerator door and, after looking around, helped himself to a handful of raw hamburger, which he held out to Ribsy. Mrs. Sailor's voice came from the living room. "Is that you, Junior?" "Yeah," answered Joe above the plink, plunk, plunk of the piano. Only then did he remember to slam the refrigerator door. "What are you doing in the refrigerator?" asked his mother as the piano stopped plinking and plunking. "I'm not in the refrigerator. I'm in the kitchen." Joe laughed at his own joke and didn't bother to mention that he was feeding a stray dog who was gobbling the raw meat right out of his hand. From the perspective of a mom, I can clearly understand why he would have left that really, really, really big detail out. "None of your back talk. Where have you been all this time? Go on, Darlene. Go on with your practicing. I was worried sick about you," said Mrs. Sailor. "I went to the high school football game like I told you," answered Joe, as Ribsy finished the last of the hamburger and licked his hand to make sure he hadn't missed any. "I asked if I could go, and all you said was we didn't have any money for football games. I didn't need any money, so I figured I could go." "How did you get in?" asked Mrs. Sailor. "Go on, Darlene. Keep practicing." "Same way I always do," answered Joe, wiping his hand on the seat of his pants and going into the living room. Ribsy stayed behind to lick his chops. "I hung around until one of the gatekeepers just let me go in. Nobody cared. The stadium is never full for high school games." "Joe Sailor, Jr.," exclaimed his mother. "Just look at you. Now tie your shoe and tuck in your shirt tail and go and wash your face. And Darlene, go with the Pussycat Waltz. I'm not paying perfectly good money for your piano lessons and then not hearing you practice." Mrs. Sailor was inclined to be snappish when she was trying to get Darlene to practice. Ribsy was curious about these people in the living room, so he followed Joe to investigate. A girl a couple of years younger than Joe was sitting on a round piano stool. She was a thin girl who appeared to be all knees, elbow, and ponytail. Her hair was full of plastic, a plastic bandeau, a plastic barrette, and a plastic clasp around her ponytail. Mrs. Sailor was standing beside her, pointing to the music on the piano and saying, "Here I scrimp and pinch to give you piano lessons." Then she saw Ribsy. "Joe Sailor, Jr., what is that dog doing in my house?" she demanded. Ribsy knew from the way she pointed at him that she was talking about him. He distrusted the tone of her voice, and his tail drooped. "I don't know." Joe shrugged his shoulders. "He just followed me." He was watching his sister twirl around on the piano stool with her ponytail flying. If she twirled in the same direction long enough, the top of the stool would come unscrewed and she would fall over. Darlene, however, had it nicely timed. Just as the stool was about to topple, she began to twirl in the opposite direction. "Well, he can just follow you right back out," said his mother, who was finding her son quite exasperating. Joe heaved a gusty sigh. "Oh, all right. Come on, dog." Obediently, Ribsy followed Joe to the back door and allowed himself to be let out. "Don't mind her," whispered Joe, whose shirt tail was still hanging out. "She just talks that way when she's trying to make Darlene practice." The hamburger in Ribsy's stomach was filling but cold. Not having anything better to do, he sat down on the back porch. He liked Joe, and he liked hamburger, so he decided he might as well stay for another meal. If he sat by the door long enough, the boy was sure to come out again. Plink, plunk, plunk, went the piano once again. As the chill left the hamburger in his stomach, Ribsy curled up beside the washing machine and dozed off until the woman's angry voice inside the kitchen woke him. "Joe Sailor, Jr., she was saying. "Do you mean to say you fed perfectly good hamburger to a dog? Why, that was our supper. Now what are we going to have?" The piano stopped. "Mama, can we have pizza?" Darlene asked eagerly. "I'll even go to the store." "It's after dark, and besides, I don't have enough money for pizza," answered her mother. "Just wait till your father hears about this." Ribsy didn't care for the sound of an angry voice, so he got up, shook himself, and took a stroll around the neighborhood. He barked at a smug-looking cat sitting on a porch. When it didn't budge, he went on his way. It was no fun trying to chase a cat that wouldn't run. He exchanged sniffs and tail wags with a couple of dogs, who didn't seem to mind his being there, and after he had satisfied himself that the neighborhood was reasonably friendly, he trotted right back to the sailor's house and curled up by the washing machine again. The smell of macaroni and cheese that came from the kitchen did not tempt him because his stomach was full of hamburger, so he went to sleep. In the morning, when he heard people stirring in the kitchen and smelled coffee, Ribsy sat hopefully by the back door waiting for someone to open it. He even whimpered a few times, but there was so much noise inside, with people arguing, the radio playing, and Darlene dawdling over the practicing that she had not finished from the day before, that no one heard Ribsy. Mrs. Sailor had not forgotten about the hamburger, and he fed perfectly good hamburger to a stray dog. She just couldn't get over it. "Sometimes I wonder what goes on in that boy's head." "Kids like dogs," said a man's voice. "Maybe we should get him one." Plink, plunk, plunk. Plink, plunk, plunk. I want to talk about what Beverly Cleary's doing there. We know that she's repeating, which we know authors often do because that makes us, is their way of emphasizing something. But if Darlene is playing the piano, shouldn't it sound better than plink, plunk, plunk? Plink, plunk, plunk. When I read those parts, it makes me think Darlene's really not that good at playing the piano. And that's probably going to frustrate Mrs. Sailor even more because she's spending all that money to help Darlene with her lessons. "Now, if that isn't just like a man," said Mrs. Sailor, "I have enough trouble buying groceries for 4 people and paying for Darlene's piano lessons and making payments on the TV without having to get a dog." "It is now 34 minutes past 7, said the radio. "Look," said the man, "I've got trouble of my own. One of my best customers brings a dress in to be cleaned, and now I can't find the belt. If I don't find that belt by the time she comes to get her dress this afternoon, I'm going to lose her business, and we can't afford that. The dog is gone, and we didn't starve, so let's just try to forget about it." I like Mr. Sailor's perspective here. He really seems to be using some powerful thoughts to help Mrs. Sailor change her zone. "It is now 35 minutes past 7, said the radio. But the dog was not gone, as Joe discovered when, some time later, he barged out the back door with his lunch bag in his hand. He was going so fast he fell over Ribsy and dropped his lunch, which Ribsy began to sniff. His nose detected the fragrance of bologna. Joe picked himself up and rescued his lunch. "You still hanging around?" he asked as he started off for school. Ribsy followed close to Joe with his nose right against the lunch bag. Joe understood. He opened the bag and took out half a bologna sandwich, which he handed to Ribsy, who wolfed it down before he caught up with Joe. He enjoyed following a boy to school again and pranced along with his ears and tail up. When they reached the school, Joe pointed to a sign on the metal fence around the schoolyard. "See, it says no dogs allowed." He stopped to pet Ribsy before he went through the gate. Ribsy sat down for an enjoyable 20 minutes of watching what went on inside. Girls jumped rope or played kickball. Boys tossed a ball back and forth or chased one another. Girls squealed, boys yelled. Ribsy barked. It was a very pleasant interval until the buzzing of a bell put an end to it all, and all the boys and girls disappeared into the building. Ribsy then explored the neighborhood by daylight, took a nap by the schoolyard fence, and spent recess and lunch periods watching the boys and girls. Several times Joe spoke to him through the fence. The day seemed familiar to Ribsy because he had followed that same pattern with Henry so many times. After school, he followed Joe home just as he had followed Henry many times. It seemed so natural that Ribsy was beginning to forget Henry and to feel like he belonged to Joe. Of course, you know we're going to stop here. And I know, again, if we were in our classroom and I was looking